We'll begin with, I guess, sort of some brief introductory pleasantries. I am Art Carden. This is my third year at Rhodes. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and Business. Here at the college, I did my undergraduate work at the University of Alabama. I did my graduate work at Washington University in St. Louis, where I graduated with my PhD in 2006. And I've absolutely loved life here at Rhodes. And I noticed actually one of my former students, someone with whom I wrote an article for the Tennessee Encyclopedia of History and Culture, is supposed to be here, but is not yet. And so I've been asked to speak to you about globalization, specifically the economics thereof. And I've titled the talk, "The Global Economy, a Symphony of Creative Destruction." This is probably the only Neiman Center event this year where the title is a play on the title of a song by 80s and 90s heavy metal band Megadeth, who wrote a song, I believe it was late 80s or early 90s, called Symphony of Destruction. And for those of you who have read some economists of the mid-20th century, Joseph Schumpeter is a guy who popularized the term creative destruction, and that very much typifies a lot of what we see in terms of the integration of the global economy. So to begin, thank you all for having me. I'm very interested in doing this in part because, well, we're electing a president here in several weeks. Also, the meltdown in international financial markets has probably piqued some interest around the room. It certainly piqued my interest. And there's really nothing, in terms of what economists care about, there's really nothing as old as globalization. Globalization and opposition to it are basically what inspired Adam Smith to write his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations in the 18th century. And basically, people opposing globalization is what gave birth to modern economics. So we made progress. We made a lot of progress, but not quite as much progress as I would really like to see. Globalization is an economic, social, and political process. So here's what I propose to do this evening. I'm going to proceed by discussing the economics of international trade and by showing how specialization in trade create wealth. I'm then going to talk a little bit about some of the objections to economists' simple model. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how the market process is a process of creative destruction, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a term popularized by Joseph Schumpeter, and which was the title of George Mason University economist Tyler Cowen's 2002 book on the economics of culture. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the human rights implications of increasing global economic integration. What we're going to find out is that contrary to popular belief, what are derided in the developed world as sweatshops are in fact actually good for the sweatshop employees because they're better than their relevant alternatives. So that's something we'll chat about here in a little bit. Should probably go ahead and give you the outline here. All right, there we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about the economics and ethics of trade restrictions. Like I said, it's opposition to globalization is pretty much as old as, if not older than, the modern economics profession. And one thing that we talk about is that, well, if there was some way to compensate those who lose out from globalization, then somehow we should do that, and thereby increase global economic integration. I'm going to question that a little bit. And so by way of anticipation, what I'm going to conclude is that people who would see their incomes reduced by restrictions or by reductions of trade barriers do not in fact have a moral claim on society to compensate them for their loss in income. And then what we'll do is we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. And then after the break, we'll have a little discussion where I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have. And I love hearing other people's ideas. And two, answering questions helps me sharpen my own thinking on a lot of different issues. Okay. So let's begin. First, let's talk a bit about the basic economics of international trade. One of the most fundamental principles in economics, and one that I absolutely drill my Econ 101 students on, is the basic proposition that trade creates wealth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin with an example that's motivated by, or was actually originally proposed by David Friedman. He's a law professor at Santa Clara University in California and son of the great Milton Friedman, one of the 20th century's most influential economists. He asks, what if someone invented a machine that would turn corn into cars? So you have a machine, and all you do is you dump in a bunch of corn, turn a crank, and out pops a car. This garish monstrosity here. I've got no idea exactly what that is, some sort of concept car of a sort. So let's suppose that you could, with your time, in a month, you could produce, say, 500 or 5,000 bushels of corn, or you could produce a car. Now suppose that someone invents this machine where you could dump in 1,000 bushels of corn, turn the crank, out pops a car. Sound like a nice invention? Good idea? So we get more corn and more cars as a result. Good idea? Impossible. Impossible? All right. What if we name that machine Japan? So that's impossible. Okay. Sounds great. Well, that's a fantastic point. Let's talk about that here in just a second. So basically, what trade is like having a machine where we can put in corn and out pops cars. So if you name this machine Japan, then basically what we've done is we've described the international economic system. Okay. So let's continue. The basic axiom of economics is that man acts, which is to say that a man employs, when I say man, I'm being gender neutral, which is to say that he employs means to attain his consciously chosen ends. And there are 4 ways with which that you can attain ends. You can produce them yourselves, individually, without the help of anybody else. But as we're going to see, one thing that this is going to be, that's going to be a road to poverty and privation. The second thing we can do is specialize in trade, which, as we'll see in a minute, is a process by which wealth is created. The third thing we can do is steal. However, value must first be produced before it can be expropriated and redistributed, and people are not going to produce what they expect to be stolen. The fourth thing we can do is we can live off the charity of others. But once again, anything that is going to be given to us has to first be produced. In every case, increasing prosperity requires increasing production. Therefore, the road to wealth requires that we develop institutions which reward production. Production and trade are the means to wealth, and we're leaving much on the table by our refusal to enjoy all the possible gains from trade. So basically, what we're doing when we trade is we're in effect developing a mechanism by which we can enjoy more corn and more cars using fewer inputs. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little slow? My brain doesn't go I don't know.
Certainly.
The only one who knows.
Not a problem.
Your brain works so much faster than mine.
Not a problem. I've been told I speak quickly, so I will.
Your brain really works fast.
So I'll try to slow it down just a tad. Thanks. Okay. All right. Recently, John McCain, who is the Republican candidate for president, said that jobs are the most important thing that an economic system creates. Unfortunately, I'm going to argue that Senator McCain is wrong. The most important thing that an economic system creates is not jobs. The most important thing an economic system creates is goods and services. Donuts, cookies, coffee, the plates and the cups and the things that we have, the pens, copies of Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. That's what an economic system creates. That is the benefit of an economic system. Jobs, in fact, are not the benefit of an economic system. They're the cost of an economic system. If all we wanted to have was more employment, then what we could do is we could stop trading, we could destroy all of the machines, and we could go back to, say, the 19th century, where we're pushing plows behind oxen and working 16 hours a day in order to produce corn and things like that. So the takeaway point there is that trade is going to allow us to produce more output using the same number of inputs. It's also going to allow us to produce the same level of output using fewer inputs. In pretty much every case, trade makes us strictly better off. This is what we call the law of comparative advantage. So let's consider a brief example here. So you have a world in which you have 2 people who live on desert islands. One is Robinson Crusoe. Mr. Crusoe could, in a week, do one of 2 things. He can catch 15 fish, or he could catch 3 wild boars. On another island, or on the other side of the island, which is very hard to get to, you have a guy named Friday. He could catch either 2 fish, or he could catch 2 wild boars. So in this case, we know that Crusoe's a lot more productive than Friday. He can do a lot more of each. He has what economists call an absolute advantage in fish and an absolute advantage in boar catching, because he can catch more fish or he can catch more boars than Friday. The question that we want to ask, though, is can they both be made better off if they specialize in trade? Okay? In Crusoe's case, what we're interested in is not necessarily how many fish can he catch in a week per se, or not how many boars can he catch in a week per se, or in Friday's case, not how many fish or boars he can catch in a week as such, but what does it cost him, or what does it cost each of these guys to catch a fish? What does it cost each of them to catch a wild boar? In Crusoe's case, if he goes out and catches a boar, we can say he's foregoing the opportunity to catch 5 fish. So he could catch either 3 wild boars or 15 fish, suggesting that the opportunity cost, to use the techie economics term, the opportunity cost of each boar is 5 fish he could catch instead. For Friday, to catch a wild boar, since he could catch either 2 fish or 2 boars in a week, he only gives up the opportunity to catch 1 fish if he goes out and catches a wild boar. Okay? So this tells us that Friday has, to use the fancy economics term, Friday has a comparative advantage in catching wild boars, because he gives up fewer fish for every boar that he catches. Crusoe, conversely, only gives up 1/5 of a boar for every fish he catches. Friday gives up a full fish for every boar he catches. So Crusoe has a comparative advantage in catching fish, which means he gives up fewer boars, less boar meat, for every fish he goes out and catches. The implication of this is that they can both be made better off through specialization in trade. So let's consider a highly stylized example, one that will probably be on my students' midterm on Thursday. And like I said, very highly stylized example, in which, say, Robinson Crusoe spends 2/3 of his time catching fish and 1/3 of his time catching boars. Friday spends half of his time catching fish, half of his time catching boars. If they do that, then Robinson Crusoe catches 10 fish every week and catches 1 wild boar. Friday, on the other hand, catches 1 fish every week and catches 1 wild boar. In total, what they have is they have 11 fish and 2 boars. So they go on like this, and go on like this. And then Friday, they eventually run into each other at some point on the island, and Friday proposes a deal. Says, okay, Crusoe, I see that you're spending 2/3 of your time catching fish, 1/3 of your time catching boars, and I'm spending half of my time doing each. Way back before I was shipwrecked, I took an Econ 101 class at Rhodes College. And I learned something about this thing called comparative advantage. And I aced it on my midterm exam. Okay? And so I propose that we do the following. He proposes a trade. Friday suggests that they each specialize completely, with Friday specializing in boars, meaning he uses all of his time to catch boars. Crusoe specializes completely in fish. And then Friday offers to trade Crusoe 1 boar for 4 fish every week. So let's see what this does to their actual consumption. So if Crusoe, instead of spending 2/3 of his time on fish and 1/3 of his time on boars, spends all of his time catching fish, and Friday, instead of spending half his time on fish and half his time on boars, instead spends all of his time catching boars, and then they trade, Crusoe produces 15 fish and trades 4 of them to Friday. Friday catches 2 boars and trades 1 of them to Crusoe for 4 fish. So Crusoe gets 11 fish and 1 boar, whereas previously he only had 10 fish and 1 boar. Friday, where he used to have 1 fish and 1 boar, he now has 4 fish and 1 boar. And through the magic of comparative advantage, specialization, and gains from trade, what we see is that both Crusoe and Friday are better off as a result of participation in trade. Okay? And this is probably the most powerful and fundamental and yet misunderstood thing in probably all of economics. Kind of, certainly. Okay. Okay. Certainly. So this is very, very interesting in a lot of ways, because Paul Samuelson, who is another one of the most famous economists of the 20th century, one time someone asked him, what is the most important thing in economics that's also not trivial? Okay, so a lot of things in economics. Someone once said that economics is the painful elaboration of common sense. Okay? And someone wants to find an economist, someone who can state the obvious in terms of the incomprehensible. Okay, which I will humbly admit, after years of graduate training and a couple of years on the faculty here at Rhodes, I must confess we have some work to do. Anyway, so Paul Samuelson said that the law of comparative advantage is very important and non-trivial. Its importance by virtue of the fact that it's fundamental to increasing prosperity around the world. Its non-triviality is evidenced by the fact that a lot of people, if they understand it, unfortunately choose not to believe it. So here's what we end up with. We notice that Crusoe is a lot more productive than Friday. So Friday is not really good at a whole lot of stuff. Crusoe is much more productive than Friday, especially with respect to fish. Friday, not very productive in either capacity. But nonetheless, they can both be made better off via trade. And this is a very highly stylized example, drawing on historical fiction. Crusoe's made better off through trade. Friday's made better off through trade. And what we could do is we could replace Crusoe with United States, Friday with China, replace fish caught per week with software programs written, and wild boars caught per week with T-shirts produced, and the exact same logic. Applies. Okay? So when we have when we allow people to specialize in trade, we're able to get more stuff with the same resources. What Crusoe can do, he can get wild boar meat in one of two ways. He can either produce it himself, in which case he gives up 5 fish for every boar that he wishes to consume, or he can trade for it. In this case, since I assume that they've agreed on a price of 4 fish per boar, he's made better off. He can consume more. Friday can consume more, and thus via the magic of comparative advantage, they're both made better off. So it's in that sense that I think when we talk about trade wars, when we talk about there being winners and losers in trade, what we're describing is not competition in the sense of warfare, but rather cooperation. So if you ever does anybody own an iPod? Any chance? Okay, all right. So a couple of folks have an iPod. When you go home, I meant to bring in my iPod because I think the iPod is sort of the defining gizmo of the early 21st century. But if you look at the back of your iPod, it says on the back, "Designed in California, manufactured in China." So the iPod is a perfect example of this whole process of global cooperation taking place. Because should we actually physically manufacture iPods in California? Probably not. Okay, because the opportunity cost of manufacturing the physical iPods in California would be designing iPods, would be designing new phones, designing new computers, designing all sorts of great new stuff. And then China, or Chinese workers, can do the actual physical manufacturing, probably at a much lower cost than can Americans. So economic nationalism is something that's it's among the oldest and most destructive of economic fallacies. Frederick Bastiat, one of my intellectual heroes, once said, "When goods don't cross borders, armies will." Okay? So economic nationalism not only reduces wealth, but also instigates international conflict. It fails to recognize first and foremost the unintended consequences of policies aimed at restricting trade, and it also fails to recognize the unintended long-run effects of restrictions on trade. So when we pass a tariff to protect Steve the steelworker, we see that Steve steelworker has a higher take-home pay. He lives in a nicer house. Maybe he drives a nicer car. It's also easier to see U.S. Steel, or whoever Steve steelworker happens to work for, it's easier to see that they have higher profits, that their shareholders are doing better. And this looks like a great deal. But another one of the key elements of economics, and another one that my students will, I hope, know for their midterm on Thursday, is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So what's not seen, if we're protecting Steve steelworker's livelihood as a steelworker, is all of the additional production that could take place if we had cheaper steel. All of the additional medical technology, we'll say, that we're foregoing. in order to protect Steve Steelworker, in order to increase his income right here and right now. What we don't see is the money that we could save, that we could lend to Steve Steelworker's kids and send them to medical school at some point. So we'll return to that. We'll return to that here in a little bit. So what looks like a great deal for Steve Steelworker, or what might look like a great deal for Crusoe, is in fact ultimately going to work to their long-run destruction. Okay. Speaking of which, let's talk a little bit about creative destruction. So this is part of the title of the lecture, and this is the term that was popularized by Joseph Schumpeter in the middle of the 20th century. What we call the market is not usually a physical place. Rather, it's a process by which entrepreneurs and consumers are going to seek out newer and better ways to cooperate with one another in order to satisfy their wants. An entrepreneur, someone who realigns inputs in order to produce stuff, he can succeed today. He can fail tomorrow. He can fail today. He can succeed tomorrow. And over the long run, one thing that's interesting is that almost all of the meaningful benefits in a market economy accrue not to the captains of industry, but rather they accrue to normal, everyday people. Joseph Schumpeter called the market process a process of creative destruction, whereby older methods and products are going to be continually replaced by newer and better products. The market is creative in that we get newer, better ways to do things. So we have cars today. We have iPods. The market is destructive, however, in that these newer, better ways to do things replace older and generally inferior ways of doing things. So we have iPods rather than Walkmans. We have cars rather than horses and carriages. Okay, so if you've ever seen the movie Other People's Money with Danny DeVito, he has this great speech. He plays a character named Larry the Liquidator, who is derisively known as Larry the Liquidator. They're buying a cable, not a cable TV company, but goodness, I forget. Let's just say a steel company. And so he goes and he's talking at the shareholders meeting about all this stuff. And he says the last buggy whip company on earth probably produced the best buggy whip that the world has ever seen, but they were destroyed by automobiles. And are we better off for it? Probably so, in the long run. So one thing, so I mentioned, and a lot of people would find this probably controversial, that economic globalization works primarily to the benefit of the poor, or works primarily to the benefit of the common man. And to sort of illustrate this, there's a guy named Greg Easterbrook. He proposed what I thought was a very interesting thought experiment. So imagine if our multi-great-grandparents from 500 years ago were transported to Bill Gates' house today. Easterbrook asks, what would they be most surprised by? What would they find most shocking? What would they find to be the most obvious and impressive improvements in Bill Gates' standard of living relative to theirs? Easterbrook argues that what they would be most impressed by would be things that we all take for granted. Air conditioning, for example. Artificial lighting. Electricity. Running water. All of the things that we take for granted suggest, according to Easterbrook, that the inequalities that exist today, say between me and Bill Gates, are probably relatively trivial when compared to the inequalities that exist between me and my multi-great-grandfathers back in Scotland, England, and wherever in the world they were in 1400, 1500, etc. Okay? So trade allows us to have more goods, more of a lot of stuff. It also allows us to have more goods in greater variety. The lunch that I ate today kind of illustrates the cultural process that I'm identifying here. So people say, well, okay, it's great. Globalization brings us more goods. We get more stuff, but it reduces the relevant diversity. You know, it eliminates our sense of place. You know, it imposes on us a uniform national blandness, which is a term I first saw in a Calvin and Hobbes comic strip when I was little, and one that sort of stuck with me. So lunch today. Went with a friend to the Tasty Buffet at Poplar and Highland, which is a Chinese restaurant, ostensibly, and which, while it is not necessarily culturally authentic Chinese food, it represents an amalgam of American influences, an amalgam of Asian influences, and the production of a whole lot of things that, quite honestly, taste pretty good, even though they may not necessarily be culturally authentic. they nonetheless, this globalization process nonetheless provides me with a greater variety of goods and services here than I would otherwise have. So it may very well be the case you can get the same stuff in Memphis as you can get in Birmingham, as you can get in Atlanta, as you can get in Jackson. Okay? So all of these cities maybe sort of horizontally might appear to be relatively the same, but they have a greater depth in terms of the diversity of products that are available. Okay? Any sushi eaters? Fans of sushi? All right, so I'm a big fan of sushi. I absolutely love this stuff, and I think the globalization process as applied to sushi is typified or exemplified in the existence of the California roll, which is probably, I would guess, is probably the most popular sushi product in the United States. I forget exactly what all goes into a California roll, but suffice it to say, sushi was not invented in California. Okay. All right. So the market process is interesting because it encourages and rewards successful experiments, with one of the most useful byproducts of this process being the fact that it reveals knowledge and information that was previously either non-existent or, at the very best, totally unarticulated. Columnist Malcolm Gladwell from The New Yorker has an interesting online lecture in which he offers an interesting take on this when he talks about the genesis of product variety in the United States. His example, spaghetti sauce. So for years, a lot of companies were looking for the perfect spaghetti sauce. According to Gladwell, someone whose name I forget, unfortunately, came along one day and realized and said, look, if you look at the distribution of people's preferences after all these experiments, there is no perfect spaghetti sauce, singular. You need to find the perfect spaghetti sauces. So hence, we went from having spaghetti sauce, singular, to today, God only knows how many spaghetti sauces are available at Kroger. I believe it was Prego, or Campbell's Soup, I believe, owned Prego in the 70s. They took him up on his advice. They introduced Extra Chunky, and if I remember the number correctly, they made something on the order of $600 million on Extra Chunky spaghetti sauce during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's important to note that through this series of experiments, Extra Chunky was revealed. All of this additional value that could be created with something as innocuous as a slight change in spaghetti sauce was revealed. And it's important to note that profitability is what ultimately tells us what works. In this case, the profits attributable to the creation of Extra Chunky tomato sauce told its inventors that they had chosen wisely. So Malcolm Gladwell says, had you gone to someone, say in 1965 and said, describe your perfect spaghetti sauce, or had you gone to me, like right before I started college, and said, describe your perfect cup of coffee, I didn't know what Frappuccino was. I still don't really know what Frappuccino is. Nonetheless, that stuff tastes pretty good for the most part, but had you gone to someone in the 50s, 60s, etc., and said, describe your ideal spaghetti sauce, no one would have said Extra Chunky spaghetti sauce. In fact, I'm not sure that the concept Extra Chunky spaghetti sauce really had a whole lot of meaning. It's this process by which people are able to tell producers by voting with their dollars whether they like Extra Chunky spaghetti sauce or Extra Spicy spaghetti sauce or mushroom spaghetti sauce or something like that, can tell them whether they're satisfying preferences or not. An example I use in class on the role of profits in a market economy is to consider, so imagine someone opens a smoothie stand, and they say, you know what, I've got a great idea. I'm going to produce sauerkraut and sardine smoothies. And they go out, they borrow some money, they open their sauerkraut and sardine smoothie stand, and go absolutely broke in the process. Reason being, as most of my students say, because a sauerkraut and sardine smoothie sounds like it would be absolutely disgusting. Okay? So what's going to happen is this entrepreneur is going to earn a loss and get kind of slapped around by the invisible hand a little bit, which is in turn going to send them the signal that what they're doing is they're wasting resources. So Extra Chunky spaghetti sauce, you're improving people's lot in life. Sauerkraut and sardine smoothies, you're probably making people worse off. Fortunately, the profit and loss system in the market economy tells us basically that this provides the feedback mechanism that tells people whether they've chosen wisely or chosen poorly. one of my favorite economists, a guy named Tyler Cowen. In 2002, he wrote a book called Creative Destruction. In 1998, he had a book called In Praise of Commercial Culture. And one of the things I like about Cowen is he takes the reasoning of the economist and applies it to a variety of cultural issues. In addition to being a top-notch economist, he's also one of the world's leading experts on Mexican amate paintings. He's a renowned food critic in the Washington, D.C. area, and a handful of other things. And so he asks, well, is it true that globalization, that the profit motive, that the spread of capitalism around the world is in fact rendering us homogeneous or destroying local cultures? Here, he argues that the answer is no. He points out that it was the trade-introduced introduction of the knife that changed a lot of African art forms. He argues what we think of as traditional African art, for example, has a lot of elements that are in fact European. Variety in spaghetti sauce has been denigrated because of its cultural inauthenticity, but it's not clear what culturally authentic spaghetti sauce would look like, since tomatoes are not in fact native to Italy. As Cowen and one of his co-authors points out, in 1450, you could get tomatoes in Mexico. You could not get tomatoes in Italy. Okay, so it's not really clear what culturally authentic tomato sauce would be like. And innovations in cinema and the musical arts are also clearly part of the process of creative destruction. As Cowen writes, the Hawaiian steel guitar, for instance, was invented by a Czech immigrant living in California. Johnny Cash is one of my favorite vocalists. Big Johnny Cash fan. The two of my favorite recordings are his excellent covers of Depeche Mode's song Personal Jesus, which is a song they released in the 80s and one that Johnny Cash later said he wished he had written, as well as Johnny Cash's cover of Nine Inch Nails' song Hurt, which is also absolutely fantastic. So this is part of this market process, part of this process that globalization typifies, whereby people can experiment with things and learn via the feedback mechanism of profit and loss whether they're doing wisely or doing poorly. I'm also a huge Star Wars fan. I think the Star Wars movies are one of the great artistic achievements of the late 20th century, and I have on my Facebook page pictures of my 2 months old's first viewing of Star Wars. Just absolutely a defining moment in young Jacob Carden's life. Okay? But Star Wars itself is basically, it's one part Flash Gordon, one part Akira Kurosawa, and one part high technology and high concept. In fact, for those of you like me who can quote Star Wars movies chapter and verse, might remember C-3PO saying that droids are made to suffer. It's their lot in life. That line is lifted directly from Akira Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai. So it's this cultural process of globalization, in addition to an economic process of globalization, that increases our standards of living, that increases our well-being, that ultimately makes us better off, and that tells people whether they are creating value or wasting resources. Okay? It's true that there's nothing new under the sun, as the writer of Ecclesiastes once said, but value is created as we recombine all of this nothing new in innovative and novel ways. Let's talk about a couple of... Certainly, yes.
Would you rather wait to get through?
I'll go right ahead.
Well, okay. I'm thinking about the topic you just covered, one of the profit and loss, value created. But what we have seen in the last month is because of a pyramiding type scheme, that has been delayed to the point that when you find that you've chosen wisely or chosen poorly or created there was profit before there was loss, and that whole scheme just has gone out the window because timing from the time you started the process because of a pyramiding effect like letters. Now, can you address
Absolutely. That's actually. So the current financial crisis is a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm talking about tonight. I'm actually talking to a local group about that tomorrow night. But we can certainly it'll be at the Fox and Hound in South Haven at 7:00 tomorrow. So, but yeah, actually we can talk about that. We can talk about that during the Q&A and during the discussion a little bit later. You're absolutely right. The problem. But I will say this. So profit and loss generally tells people whether they're choosing wisely or choosing poorly. Government intervention, unfortunately, oftentimes distorts profit and loss calculations. So it tells people they're choosing wisely when, in fact, they're choosing poorly. And So, for example, a lot of people went out and bought houses they could not afford, using money they couldn't pay back, not because they were stupid, certainly, but because, hey, this is what the signals were as a result of government interference in the economy. Banks went out and lent people a whole lot of money they couldn't pay back. Again, not because they were stupid or not because they were evil necessarily, but just because that's what the signals were in the marketplace, because, say, the Federal Reserve had printed too much money, or Congress had leaned on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to increase the supply of affordable housing. But we can come back to that a little bit later if you'd like. Okay. All right, so let's talk about a couple of quick objections to globalization. Then we'll take a break. The first is the popular objection that globalization engenders human rights abuses as multinational corporations exploit differences in international labor standards and that therefore exploit their workers in developing countries. Unfortunately, this is based on flawed economic reasoning. So as repulsive as it may sound to us, the people who work in sweatshops generally aren't forced to be there. They work there not because they're being forced or because they're being exploited, but because, unfortunately, the reality is such that working in an unventilated, unlighted factory for 14 hours a day for 25 cents an hour is better than their next available option. Okay? So, unfortunately, one thing that we learned is that international crusading for so-called workers' rights will usually hurt exactly the people that the crusades are purported to help. And sadly, they're often sort of a thin veil designed to protect workers in rich countries from competition by workers in poor countries. Again, sweatshops are often the best alternative available in poor countries. The wages and working conditions they're deplorable to rich Westerners. There's a reason I don't work in a sweatshop, because my next best alternative, which is standing around and talking about things I find interesting, is much, much, much better than and much, much more preferable to working in a sweatshop. Unfortunately, though, many workers in developing countries don't have the luxury of cushy jobs in climate-controlled offices, like a lot of us do. Paul Krugman, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics this morning, has written that dangerous jobs at low wages are usually better than no jobs at all, and often the only alternative to a dangerous job at low wages is a more dangerous job at even lower wages. Okay? Economists Benjamin Powell and David Scarbeck have studied the wages and working conditions in, say, textile sweatshops around the world and have found that those wages and working conditions are actually above average for the countries in which they operate. So what we see as a deplorable sweatshop is in fact a plum job in a country where people are desperately, desperately, desperately poor. Okay? So the anti-sweatshop movement, unfortunately, can have disastrous unintended consequences. Ben Powell, again, one of the economists I just mentioned, reports that according to a British charity, many of the 50,000 or so Bangladeshi children who were laid off in response to threats from the United States about child labor, they didn't go to school. They didn't go to better jobs. They didn't spend more time playing. A lot of them turned to child prostitution. Okay? So working in a sweatshop was their best available option. Once that option was taken away from them, many of them had no choice but to prostitute themselves in order to feed themselves and feed their family. Okay? As economist David Henderson has pointed out, we do people no favors when we take away from them the best of a lot of very bad options. So the way to increase people's living standards is not by restricting trade, not by saying thou shalt not trade with people who are very poor, thou shalt not pay people very low wages, but rather to increase their productivity via education, via expanding trade, via technological investment, and via investment in new capital. The last question I wish to consider this evening steps a little bit outside the realm of economics and asks whether the so-called losers from increased international trade are entitled to compensation. So let's suppose that, to make this relatively robust, because people criticize economists for this a lot, because quite honestly, our lives are pretty nice. They say, well, if you were a steel worker or something like that, if you weren't in your cushy climate-controlled position, then you would see things differently. So let's suppose that we eliminate immigration restrictions for highly skilled workers, and let's suppose that we basically drop all barriers to international trade, such that there is now major competition to me from economists from around the world. So Indian economists, Chinese economists are now gunning for my job. Okay, so the question that we would want to ask is, if my wages are lowered, if my standard of living falls as a result of international competition, would I be morally entitled to compensation from society? Okay, and this, again, this is not specifically an economics, this is not an economic question. As such, it's primarily ethical. Okay? So debates about international trade are going to be couched in domestic concerns about what will happen to people who are laid off as a result of increasing trade. And a lot of times the biblical command to love thy neighbor has been justified, or has been invoked to justify restrictions on international trade. We have to remember, though, that when we're asking a question about government policy, we're asking a question about when it is and is not permissible to use force or the threat thereof. George Washington said, government is not eloquence, government is force. That's the defining characteristic of the government, the thing that separates them from you, me, from Rhodes College, from Walmart, from Kroger, from everybody, is that government has the right and the ability to use force, potentially deadly force, if necessary, in order to do what they want to do. Okay, so we can compensate those who are made worse off by international trade in a couple of different ways. First, we can bribe people who benefit from tariffs in order to have those tariffs removed. The second thing we can do is we can bribe people who would otherwise seek the imposition of tariffs. So again, thinking about a lot of external competition, say for economists, one thing that I might do is I might say, well, let's make sure that we keep these restrictions on H-1B visas. And I'll be honest, I would not be surprised if my wages are probably higher than they otherwise would be, because there are large barriers to skilled workers entering the United States. Or I might say, what we should do is I want my wages to be higher, therefore we should impose even greater barriers on people who wish to export economics teaching to American students. So the interesting question is, do we have a moral obligation to compensate those whose incomes would decrease as a result of increasing global integration? I answer no. And I'd say this for a couple of different reasons. So in the event that, say, there's a flood of Indian and Chinese economists who come into the United States and my income goes down, I would argue that you do not have a moral obligation to compensate me for a fall in income for a couple of reasons. The first thing is, if you have to compensate anybody who's made worse off by a change in the status quo, or if you're going to compensate me, you have to compensate anyone who's made worse off as a result of a change in the status quo. So that would result, so a utilitarian reason not to buy that is that it would result in social gridlock and stagnation. The second thing is that compensating the losers from international trade is going to deprive innovators who would find better and cheaper ways to satisfy our wants of their just reward. So if someone from another country can come up with a better way to educate people about economics and come up with a better way to do economic research than I can, then presumably he's entitled to some reward for that. Okay? Compensating me for his innovation tends to deprive him of something that might be rightfully his. And then finally, to the extent that people owe their standards of living to trade barriers that prevent other people from participating in the international marketplace, they've been the unjust recipients of above normal incomes. And if anyone is owed anything, it's the protected who owe the rest of us, or it's me who owes you, to the extent that my income is higher as a result of immigration restrictions and not the other way around. Voluntary trade between two individuals is the business of only the individuals who are party to the transaction. If I don't approve of a transaction that you make, that's my problem. I have no moral authority to step in and say, thou shalt not. Further, if you're unsatisfied with the contents of this lecture and wish to seek economics training from a different economist, I have no right to prevent you from doing so. Okay? Protectionism, though, is often justified because it protects jobs. So I might say, well, what we need to have these immigration restrictions. We need to have barriers to to free trade in international economics because it protects my job. It protects American economist jobs. But that can be really expensive. It's been estimated that every job in the steel industry that's saved by protectionist tariffs costs taxpayers and consumers $750,000 per job per year. So every steel job in the United States that's saved by tariffs, $750,000 per job per year. I don't know what the number is for economists, but give that to a student as a senior project. I'm not sure that I want to know. Thus, the protected steel worker is skinning the public to the tune of $750,000, not just in higher wages, but also in the form of lost productivity. Okay, so I looked up a little bit of data earlier today. So this means that every steel job in the United States protected by tariffs costs us the annual average income of 5 pediatricians. So every additional steel worker we have in the United States, for all intents and purposes, costs us 5 additional pediatricians. Okay, and so putting it in stark human terms, protecting Steve's steelworker means less health care for his children, less health care for my children, and to the extent that the source of, say, Steve's higher income is the ability to use the power of the government to force others to employ him, well, what should we say about this? Look, justice is our standard. If efficiency is our standard, Steve's steelworker should be paying us. I should be paying you, because I'm enjoying an above normal income as a result of immigration restrictions. $750,000 a year is a lot of money, and there's no telling what revolutionary innovations have been lost in order to protect jobs. So what do we do about it? There's so my last little bit before we take a break is going to borrow from an economist named Hal Varian and say, so what if we wish to remain competitive in a global marketplace? What should we do? So as an economist, I've always been and always will be, or always expect to be, an unrepentant free trader. Even though it would lower my wages, I would say we should let in skilled immigrants. Even though it would lower my wages, I would say let's trade freely with other countries, even if my skills as an economist find a lower value on the marketplace. It raises an important question: how do we insulate ourselves against sudden declines in standards of living if our jobs go overseas? So if all of the economics education jobs go to India or China. A couple of answers here. The first is to make sure that we save enough individually to have something to fall back on in case our jobs are eliminated. Okay? This is generally going to be a short-run effect. Okay? So I could argue here, well, I'll forget about that for now. The second thing to do is to diversify our skill portfolio. This is where Hal Varian comes into play. He spent most of his career at the University of Michigan and the University of California at Berkeley. He's now an economist at Google. Okay, so back when he started his career as an economist, Google didn't exist. There would have been no opportunity for him to be the chief economist at Google. But he argues that what we should do is develop skills which are complementary to stuff that is falling in price, but that are nonetheless remaining very, very hard to obtain. So analytical skills and design skills are going to be complements to data collection and to manufacturing of physical outputs, and thus all of the very high incomes, all the high income jobs are not going to be in manufacturing cars, not going to be in manufacturing steel, but rather are going to be in designing new cars, in designing new processes by which to create steel, and by designing new products we can produce with steel, new products we can produce with plastic, new products we can produce with all of these things that are not new under the sun, but for which new combinations of those things can create value. So to make a long story short, anyone who's counting on earning a middle-class income in a factory job is probably on the road to poverty. However, those who are concentrating their time and energy on learning problem-solving skills and analytical techniques are poised to compete in the 21st century economy. So there are a couple of takeaway points from this. One, trade creates wealth. Trade allows us to produce more stuff with the same resources, or the same amount of stuff with fewer resources. Moreover, lost my thought here. Moreover, the market process is a process by which people learn whether they're creating value or not through the system of profit and loss. Then, it turns out actually that this market process, this process of globalization, all of the benefits are generally going to accrue to the least of these among us. And then finally, we can't really make a moral claim that anyone is entitled to compensation as a result of the fact that, say, their wages might go down as a result of increasing integration in the global economy. And the way that we can remain competitive is by diversifying our skill portfolio and by focusing ever more attention on those areas where we have a comparative advantage, specifically design and analysis. So thank you all very much for your time and attention. I'm happy to answer any questions. The break is in just a couple of minutes, and then we will have a discussion afterward.